Well, let us now go to Neil Oliver, who is our man in the culture tent, our man who's keeping an eye on the way that we are kind of evolving through this pandemic and this lockdown. Neil, a very good morning to you. Welcome back.
Good morning. I hope there's more than me keeping an eye on what's going on.
Well, I mean, I put you firmly at the gate of the Independent Republic of Mike Graham, keeping an eye on the sort of culture going in and going out. So it's only a small part of the rest of the world, basically. But it's been an interesting week because we've sort of moved from, I suppose, the protests and the violence of the week before to a kind of much more civilised debate, albeit a rather rancid one, about the right of free speech.
Well, I suppose everything's always going to come back to this, the necessity for free speech. Really, I suppose I get almost exhausted by thinking about what free speech means.
Yes.
I think increasingly some people, when they hear free speech, it almost seems to mean freedom from speech.
Yeah.
I think for some people, free speech means never needing to hear something that you don't want to hear.
Right.
But for me, it's always, we were talking about this last week, it has to be about the freedom to have an ongoing conversation and to be able to air your views, however unpalatable they might be to other people. It's like, I mean, for me, no matter how unpleasant someone else's views might be, it's like knowing there's a mouse in your house or there's a spider in your bedroom. You want to be able to see it. You know, it's worse if you just know that
if you know it's there,
yes, you don't like, but you need to be able to see it. And if you discourage people or frighten people or intimidate people into not speaking, they don't stop thinking what they think, and they don't stop doing what they do, and they don't stop acting in the way that their beliefs make them act. It's just that you no longer have any way of tracking them. They've effectively been pushed off of the radar screen, and that's a backward step.
Yes, and does that for you? Does that for you, Neil? It mean everyone? Because there are some in society who will say, well, the terrible people on the far right shouldn't be allowed to have access to social media, but the far left are okay. I mean, do you say that as a universal thing?
I do. My simple, honest answer to that question is I think it's in the best interests of everyone if anyone and everyone is able to air their views. I mean, you don't necessarily give everyone the loudest microphone, transmitting to millions or billions of people.
Right.
There are people make judgment calls about who gets the loudest voice, but every voice must, in my opinion, be free to speak. And I don't mind being offended at all.
Right.
It's part of how you rub up alongside people in your vicinity and work out whether you can do something with them or whether they're best avoided. But if you just drive people into silence, you just make invisible a threat that hasn't gone anywhere.
Well, I find myself
it's by engaging in conversation. If whatever your view is, whatever's going on inside your little head, it's when you discuss it, air it in front of other people, some of whom you know, some of whom you don't know. The corners, the problematic bits of your opinion might actually get chipped off, and you end up coming away from the conversation that ensues with a better version of your original opinion. That is how we learn as individuals. If you're a party person, I don't understand how anyone can see themselves as a member of a group or of a political party and stay there forever, because you can only do that if you stop thinking and allow the group to think on your behalf, and you then just become a mouthpiece for that group.
Yes.
But to me, if you keep thinking, if you keep asking your own questions and seeking your own answers, then you inevitably think your way right out the other side of the party. But you'll leave the party behind.
Yes. Well, see, I find myself sometimes asking myself the question: am I the only person in the world that doesn't actually get offended? Because I find it very difficult to be offended. I mean, I can't remember the last time somebody offended me with something that they said, because I might not agree with it. I might not think it was a smart thing to say. I might even think it was in bad taste. But it doesn't actually offend me. I don't think I don't understand people who are offended by things that people say.
No, I think this drift into ideas of people being triggered and people being hurt by things that they hear is not that's not a state of affairs that we should usefully allow to continue. If someone hits you, if someone strikes you with a stone or hits you with a stick, then you're in peril. Then you're in physical danger.
Yes.
Might end up with you dying.
Yeah.
But no matter what someone is saying, airing in the public domain, it doesn't actually hurt you. And as long as it's out there in the public where everyone else can hear it, then you needn't be at threat from it, because you can challenge what it is that you're hearing that you don't agree with. And if you speak fluently and logically, and you make a reasoned argument, then you will find support. And so that you won't be alone in opposing that opinion which you don't agree with.
Right.
I've lost track of what being offended even means.
Right.
Really, etymologically. I mean, just not agreeing with someone is not a bad thing, and it won't do you any harm.
No, in fact, quite the reverse. I mean, I grew up, it may not surprise you to know, in a household with two Scottish parents, and all we did for a living, it seemed, was argue. But it was good-natured arguing. It wasn't about offending people or saying things that were horrible. It was all consistently about a conversation that just went on constantly. And I learned an awful lot at the hands and at the feet of my parents about that. And there's no coincidence that I've ended up doing it for a living.
Yes.
And I think that that's a very healthy way to be. Because I was looking at some of your tweets this week about the whole J.K. Rowling situation and how some authors who you would think would be the enlightened people who write books for a living wanted her shut down, wanted the publishing company to kind of get rid of her because they didn't agree with something that she said.
Well, that would be the antithesis of everything that I would believe. And it's certainly not the way that I would act. And I would have thought that people who write and want to communicate with words would be the very people who would defend trenchantly anyone else's right. I mean, I wouldn't. There are also. I don't know. There will be books that have notorious reputations out there, and I would hope that they continue to be published and on the shelves of bookshops, so that you can go in and be confronted with ideas that you might think are terrible, and you might think that ideas that have to be challenged with your very last breath. But if they're taken away from the bookshops, and if the books are burned, you don't know what it is you should be disagreeing with.
Right.
But people don't stop believing what they believe just because they're no longer allowed to say and to express what it is that they believe, and it becomes infinitely more dangerous. To me, it is in essence why I am wary of, more than that, I'm opposed to any ideology. I am a non-ideological person, because any ideology is basically an oversimplification. It's an oversimplified answer to an infinitely complicated set of questions.
And it's also, in some ways, it's a prison, isn't it? Because, I mean, the people that I know, for example, politically, who are ideologically based, have a certain sort of trigger system of reaction. And if somebody says something which confronts their ideology, they're not really sure how to handle it.
No, if you think, heaven help you, if you think that any one human being can come up with an ideology which is going to be the answer to every question in your future for the rest of your life. If someone sat down beside you on the bus and said that they had the answer to every question, you would probably do well to drift quietly away from that person. Yeah. Because they don't. But ideologies are it's like a rough map. It's like a very crude map. It's like the things that you used to see that put whatever, some of the early maps put Jerusalem at the center of the world. Yes. And then they had this amorphous shape that no one can recognize any of the modern continents in. And it was only by constant exploration without end, that finally the map was finessed and nuanced, and we began to see actually where America was in relation to Europe and where Africa was in relation to the Mediterranean and whatever. So any ideology, be it Marxism or communism or any other, if it seems to be a universal theory of everything, an answer to every question, then it is by definition wrong. And the only hope for humanity, the only hope for civilized society, is for conversations without end. You're talking about growing up in a family where your mum and dad and your siblings and whatever, you just argued all the time. Yeah. That is the way it's supposed to be. And I'm presuming that you're still in conversation with at least some of those members of your family and the wider circle of people with whom you were engaged in conversation. As soon as you allow the calcification of your ideas within an overarching ideology, then you're in real trouble.
Yes.
Because it is inevitable that because the world changes all the time, and the environment is always shifting, and the climate's always changing, and political and naturally, that situations will arise that the ideology cannot handle. And so an ideology is like when you build a sandcastle on the beach, and as long as it's got the wet of the water in it, then it's quite secure and solid, and it retains its shape. But inevitably the water drains out of the sandcastle, and it becomes a desiccated thing that the wind just blows away. And that's an ideology. It cannot retain its shape forever, because a way of thinking is a dead thing. Almost as soon as it happens, the water drains out of it. It's up to us as the inhabitants of the present day, of the here and now, to constantly revivify the ideas and to constantly challenge every ideology and move it forward and keep on finessing it and adding more detail to the map that we have of reality. That's what we're doing by having these conversations. We're constantly reaching out, as the ancestors did thousands of years ago.
Well, interesting, isn't it? Because like our conversation last week, Neil, it takes us back to that tribal thing where some people find comfort in ideology because they feel as if they have a common bond with other people, which again is something I don't really get. I much prefer to have my own thought process. I much prefer to do things for myself. I don't wish to seek sort of the solace of a group. I don't like to be part of any group, really. And in fact, if a group forms, I immediately walk the other way.
I have that in common with you, Mike. I'm always slightly disappointed when I was a teenager. I used to find out if somebody else was listening to the same LPs as me. I was always terribly disappointed, and it ruined my music, and I had to move on.
Right.
And I had to find something else that was so obscure that I could launch into conversations about it, and nobody knew what I was talking about.
And what was the most obscure album you found?
Probably Tales from Topographic Oceans.
Oh yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I knew that. I had that one.
There
you go. You wouldn't have liked me.
There's another one. But I was always disappointed, really, when I realised that I was becoming part of a group. The only people that I really feel the only person I feel I represent is me.
Yes.
Neil Oliver. I can only speak for me.
Right.
And then I widen that out a little bit to my wife and my kids and my parents and my in-laws. But even at that, I can't speak for them. I can't speak for my father-in-law or my mother-in-law or for my mum, because I can only speak for me. And they are the people that I love most in the world, and they challenge my opinions all the time.
Right.
Like you say, I'm constantly, and that's with people who've known me for, all of them upwards, some of them for their whole lives, and some of them for in excess of 30 years.
Yeah.
We're still arguing.
Well, this is it. I mean, I've had a couple of instances, funnily enough, this week, which have been interesting, whereby I spoke to Kevin O'Sullivan on Sunday on his show about how disappointed I was lately with Boris Johnson and his kind of slight dithering over coming out of the lockdown, which he's now fixed as of yesterday. And people were like, please don't knock the government. Please don't knock the Prime Minister. We listen to you because you don't do that. And I said, well, I'm very glad that you listen to me, but, I reserve the right to do whatever I want. And if I decide to have an opinion, I'm not going to not have that opinion because you don't expect me to have it.
Yes, I mean, there's an old sort of like a philosophical argument that in the nature of the best kind of friendship, if your friend says that they want to walk towards the rising sun, you should say, well, I want to walk towards the setting sun. Because if you just fall in with somebody else's steps that are not your own, the whole thing will eventually deteriorate into a kind of a hypocrisy.
Yes.
One of you is just pretending to go along with the other person.
Yeah.
And so the success is by constantly pulling in opposite directions. It's that tension that provides structure. If you just meekly say, I agree with everything I'm being told by the group that I feel I belong to,
yes,
then you've stopped thinking for yourself and you've stopped contributing. I think a lot of people go through life feeling that they don't make any difference, that as a humble, ordinary person in the street individual, they can't make any difference. But that, I think, is a very nihilistic way to live. I think the reality is that with every action that you make, everything you say, everything you do every day is actually shaping the future, even if only in a small way. So even if it's just actions as simple as tidying up the dishes from breakfast before you walk out of the door, that means that in the future you're going to walk into the house at the end of the day and everything's tidy. So you can actually make a positive contribution with your every thought, and that's why you must keep speaking. You mustn't be silenced, Not by anyone, not by your partner,
Right.
not by the community, and not by the nation. You must never be silenced, because that's the ultimate submission. And there's a lot of submission being encouraged at the moment.
Yes.
People are being encouraged to stop thinking, stop speaking, we know better, submit to this idea and everything will be all right. And that's ideology, that's the advance towards a utopia. And utopia is a word that literally means nowhere. Utopia means no place. It doesn't exist. And the only hope is that you keep on having a conversation without end. And the moment that you feel too frightened or that you're not clever enough to speak, then you're finished.
Yes. No, I couldn't agree more.
And the world and your community and your family is and are diminished because you have stopped contributing, and everyone can contribute.
I agree with that totally. Now, before we go, I must ask you about your sort of area of expertise. A fascinating discovery made earlier this week, or towards the end of last week, in Stonehenge, a ring of large shafts discovered, which people are saying they think had some connection to the boundary of this kind of sacred area. I mean, I used to live very close to Stonehenge. I've always found it quite fascinating, and in some ways, actually, the barrows and other stone circles around the area, in some ways, even more interesting than Stonehenge's. But it's a fascinating part of the world, isn't it?
Absolutely. I'm really an archaeologist, and the Neolithic, which is the period which has gifted us this extraordinary discovery, is the time of the first farming, and that's the period that fascinates me more than anything else. And that we are still learning things about the environs of Stonehenge. I think the circle of shafts is actually around Durrington Walls, which is a place for the living. Really, it's where people lived and feasted during the time of the constant reworking of Stonehenge. And it's an embodiment of what we're talking about, Mike, because these places, as far as we can tell, Stonehenge was being built and modified for more than well over 1,000 years, an unimaginable period of time, and it was never finished. People eventually found reasons to walk away from it. Likewise, Avebury, this massive construction that people were working on generation after generation, it was never finished. And in all likelihood, this set of vast shafts around Durrington Walls is another project that was never finished. But it's a lesson from the past. This is a lesson from 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, that these people weren't ever imagining that the job was done. Everything in the way that they sought to understand the sky above them and the world around them was based on constantly modifying their ideas. And that manifested itself in the constant reworking of those places. I mean, closer to home in a way, the Sagrada Familia, that amazing church, cathedral, basilica
Beautiful
in
place,
Barcelona by Gaudi.
Yeah.
Work was started on that in the 1880s. Gaudi took over as chief architect and then died in 1926 when the thing was only a quarter done. And to this day, it's still being built. And that is the essence of what matters. Just in the same way that Stonehenge was never finished, and the Sagrada Familia has never been finished, then the conversations that we have with each other about how we understand our place in the world, in our communities, in the cosmos is endless. And the moment you surrender to an ideology that says this is the final answer, the only answer you will ever need, that you walk away from that person and you think, no, there's yet another nuance, yet another adjustment, yet another architectural flourish to be added that will make the picture more complete. And that's, in essence, to me, that's what that discovery at Stonehenge or Durrington Walls says. It's a reminder from thousands of years ago that people understood that the job was never finished, the answer was never complete, the map was never perfectly drawn. And every word that every one of us utters, logically and reasonably in the open forum of debate, adds a little bit more information from which we can all benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. What a great way to end the conversation. Neil, thank you very much again for a very enlightening and illuminating series of things to have said, because we are constantly looking for the answer. Neil Oliver, TV presenter, archaeologist, man of great wisdom, I think you would say.